Our reading this morning is 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 1 through 12. 2 Samuel 15, 1 through 12. Hear the word of the Lord. Now it came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. And when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king." Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land. Then every man who has any suit or cause could come to me, and I would give him justice." And when a man came near to prostrate himself before him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. In this manner Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. Now it came about at the end of 40 years that Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron. For your servant vowed a vow while I was living at Geshur in Aram, saying, 'If the Lord shall indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord.' The king said to him, 'Go in peace.' So he arose and went to Hebron. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, 'As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom is king in Hebron.' Then 200 men went with Absalom from Jerusalem, who were invited and went innocently, and they did not know anything. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo, while he was offering the sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom." One of the most devastating crimes we face in the modern era is what is called identity theft. It's a problem because people have found themselves robbed of their money and saddled with crippling debt because someone assumed their identity and took action in their name. And of course, if you have all the identifying marks of a person, whatever action you take, it can be very hard for that person to prove it should not have been done and that you did not want it done. We think of this as a new phenomenon, this thing called identity theft, but actually it's gone on for ages. People have always struggled to prevent other people from stealing their name and their authority. You may notice as I'm up here, I wear a ring on each hand, a wedding ring and then this other ring. Well, my wife actually got me this when we were engaged, and it is a signet ring. It's outdated, I know. I have no use for a signet ring, but I like it because I like old-fashioned things. I think they're cool. Shows my wife knows my character that she got this for me. Well, why did we invent seals and signets? Because in the old days, you didn't have a birth certificate, you didn't have a photo ID, you didn't have a passport. All you had was what you could make, and they figured out, I know what I'll do. I'll have someone make a design on a ring or a stamp, or in the very earliest versions, you actually rolled your seal across wax or clay. And they said, that way, I'll have a design that's not like anyone else's. And that's how you'll know it's me who sealed the document. And then, of course, what you do if you wanted to do something, you had to actually steal the signet ring, and you had to steal the seal and use it without the other person knowing, because then how on earth were they going to prove? Just like today, you steal someone's PIN number or their credit card number. It's the same thing. It's identity theft. Been going on forever. And one of the oldest identity thieves in history is still operating. The devil has been encouraging the spirit of Antichrist from the beginning as part of his rebellion against God. We touched on this last week. That from the very beginning, the devil has wanted to take the place of God, and as soon as he saw that God had appointed Jesus as the Christ, he wants someone to take Christ's place over the people of God. This passage, this story, shows us how the scam works by giving us a profile of a deceiver. A profile of a deceiver. This is what an antichrist looks like. First, we see that deceivers win over the people by mimicking the character and the attributes of Christ. We know that Jesus is glorious, so deceivers seek to make themselves appear glorious. Absalom was not the king. He was a prince. He was presumed by many to be the crown prince, the one next in line for the throne. He wasn't, but he wanted people to think that. He wanted himself to look like a king, though, so he took on a kingly appearance by riding in a chariot. What is the purpose of a chariot? That's a war vehicle. That is what you use to fight people in. Now today, our modern leaders don't drive around in tanks, but what do they drive around in? Have you ever seen the president's limousine? You ever watch on Inauguration Day? Have you ever seen them open the door for him? That is a thick door. That is not a normal limo. That limo is actually built like a tank to protect him. So if you want to make yourself look important, you don't just get a limo and a driver, you get a bulletproof limo. And you get an armed driver. That implies people want to kill you. That implies you're important enough that people would want to do that. If you've got enemies, you've got power. Because if you've got power, you've got enemies. So Absalom, he wants to make himself look like the man who will fight for Israel. Gets himself a chariot, but not just a chariot. Oh no. Because when you're the boss, you don't get out of the way for other people. Other people get out of the way for you. So he gets himself 50 men whose job is to run in front of his chariot. And this isn't like the Secret Service doing the slow jog in front of the president's limousine. These are men running, going, Absalom is coming! Absalom is coming! And people would clear the streets and make way for Absalom. Now, when you get used to making way for someone long enough, you start to conclude this is someone you ought to make way for. Deceivers cover their emptiness by adopting the external marks of glory. He wasn't king. There was no reason for him to have these things, but by having them, people just started to assume that he ought to have them. He had covered over the fact that he wasn't on the throne by making people feel like he was on the throne. That's how it works. You'll note that throughout history, as the gospel has gone out of a church, external marks become more and more important. For a long time, the Protestant reformers said you can tell there's a problem with Rome because when you walked into a Roman church, what did you see? Gold. Everywhere. Gold. Gold on the altar. Gold on the walls. Gold in the vestments. Gold, gold, gold. To this day, you very often see gold everywhere. Why? Because they weren't and aren't preaching this word. This is their glory. Once you dull the word of God, you've got to get glory somewhere else. The East, to this day, still has gold. I've only been to one or two Eastern Orthodox services, and man, I went to this little itty-bitty tiny building because it was not an Eastern Orthodox cathedral. This was a tiny Orthodox church in a very not Eastern Orthodox city. But you walk in, and I was like, whoa, gold everywhere. I was like, where's the security system? This place looks like a glorified trailer. Anybody could break in here. Why is all this gold here? That's all they got. Liberal churches cling to high ceremony. You watch any mainline church, very lofty worship tradition, very high church. And I have nothing against high church ceremonies. I actually am a bit of a traditionalist myself. But still, why do they have to do it that way? Because they stopped preaching the gospel and they've got to get loftiness from somewhere. And old things look and feel lofty. And prosperity preachers, well, they got to have the expensive suits, the jets, the big houses. The thing is, we are called to display the glory of Christ, not our own glory. If someone points to their station and not to Christ, they are a deceiver. If someone insists upon exalting their position, exalting their office, reminding you of how glorious and great they are, that person is deceiving you, because they should be pointing you to Jesus Christ. That is what it's all about. We also know that Jesus is our deliverer. So deceivers promise to give us deliverance. Absalom, by his own admission, was not a judge among the people, nor was his cause just. So what did he do? Do you notice this? This is a brilliant ploy. I've got to give him credit for a genius ploy. He would call out to somebody, "Where are you from, my friend?" "Well, I'm from somewhere." They didn't actually say, "I'm from one of the tribes of Israel." The Bible has its own way of, like we do, "I'm from such and such a place." He said fill in the blank. And he would pull them over and he'd listen to their calls attentively. And like a good politician, "Your cause is just. I feel your pain, brother. But there is no one who hears your cause from the king." Well, of course nobody from the king hears their cause. You called them away before they could talk to an actual judge. And now you tell them, "Well, there's no one who would hear you anyway. The king is just not listening. If I were the judge, then I would give people justice. I'd be available to hear the people." Well, the king was available to hear the people. He just heard the woman from Tekoa. For crying out loud, Absalom, get out of their way and he'll hear all the people he can. But this genius, this evil, maniacal genius, has got them pulled to the side, and then he makes it look like it's David's fault, and like he's the better alternative. David isn't doing what he should do, but I, Absalom, I would deliver you. Deceivers work hard to keep the people away from Jesus and the true gospel. Instead, they tell people that they are the source of salvation. I've read a lot of things written by ex-Mormons. You know what they all say? When you're in the Mormon church, you're not encouraged to read the Bible. What are you encouraged to read? The Book of Mormon. They have Bibles, but they're told you really need to read the Book of Mormon. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, do you know what you're told to read? Watchtower magazine. In fact, they have Bibles, but they're told not to read the Bible without Watchtower beside it, and only to read the passages that Watchtower tells them to read in the Watchtower articles. A Jehovah's Witness even said that they were instructed, if you have to choose between reading the Bible and reading Watchtower, read the magazine and leave the Bible aside. Why? Because they know if you start paying attention to the Bible, it will give you real deliverance. We have to shove it to one side to convince you that we're the only ones who can actually deliver you. Jesus has saved us by his life and his death. If someone points you to themselves as your hope and not Jesus, they are a deceiver. Jesus is the only one who has accomplished salvation. If anyone says you have to go through me to get Jesus, that person is lying. because Jesus is the only intercessor between God and man. His is the only name given among men by which we must be saved. There is no one who can get between you and Jesus Christ. And if they say they can, or that you need them in addition to or instead of Jesus, they're lying. Run. We also see that Jesus humbled himself. So deceivers display false humility. Absalom prevented people from doing homage to them, or to him, honoring them as if they were equals. And this made him appear to be a man of the people, among the people. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, wait a minute. You said first that he built up his own glory, and now he acts with humility. Well, you've got to remember, Christ is glorious, right? Christ is God on high, seated at the right hand of the Father, co-equal with him from all of eternity. When he was on the Mount of Transfiguration, he shone with brightness. His clothes were whiter than any launderer could make them. When he appeared, even in his glorified humanity, when he appeared before John the Apostle, he fell on his face before him. But remember, in that very same passage, as John is lying there stunned, Jesus reaches out his hand and touches him. This great God has come and become a man and walked among us. The human heart knows, because we are created by God in his image and we live among his creation, we all know that God is glorious and humble. And deceivers have to fake both. So Absalom comes. No, don't bow down to me. Never mind my chariot and my 50 men telling you to get out of the way. I am one of you. And yes, he kisses them, and we're like, okay, what's up with that? That's like a handshake to us. Absalom's the politician. I'm a man of the people. Look at him right in the eye, firm handshake. It's all good. We know what God is supposed to look like. Deceivers have to make it look like they have come down to our level to serve our interests. I mean, honestly, the Pope in Rome calls himself Vicar of Christ, representative of Jesus, ruler of the Church of God, declares that he can do nothing wrong. He's infallible as long as he's dealing with church matters. Do you know what other title he takes? Servant of the servants of Christ. Well, I'm just one of you. In fact, I'm the hardest working one of you because I have to serve all the servants. Oh, cry me a river in your golden palace. Come on. But that's what they do. Deceivers have to fake humility. Christ did announce his humility, but he did it because he's God. For him to serve was worth noting. When Christ washed the disciples' feet, he said, now I want you to take note of what I did. But he had to do that because he said to them, you call me Lord and Master, and that's right because I am. But I came not to be served, but to serve. You do the same. The apostles had to announce their humility because they were given the authority of Christ to speak in his name. Paul would sometimes have to remind people, I could order you to do a thing, but I am asking you instead. Because it's better for you to do this willingly than that I command you to do it. Everyone else in the world, they don't have any reason to announce how humble they are. Unless you're Jesus or have been commissioned by Jesus to speak with all his authority, you're just some guy. Anyone who has to tell you how humble they are is actually bragging. They are saying, behold, I have come down to your level, which means I am that far above you that I had to step down. Don't forget how humble I am. I am but one of you, which means I'm not really one of you, at least in my own mind. I think I'm very highly exalted above you. If anyone believes that they are above you and worthy of being served, even if they refuse that service, they are no true follower of Christ. Followers of Christ wash each other's feet because we know we're not worthy to do anything above that station. Everything else is a blessing. We do not come to be served, but to serve. So they fake glory, they fake deliverance, they fake humility. And having won over the people, deceivers make use of their political capital. Because you see, deceivers seek to take the place of Christ. Deceivers seek to claim the privileges of God's anointing for themselves. Why Hebron? Why did Absalom come to David and say, I wish to go make a sacrifice at Hebron? That's where David was anointed king. That was his first capital. That was the first seat of his power. Absalom is going back to where it all began. He's going to be declared king in Hebron. And the people will remember that David was declared king in Hebron. It looks right. It looks legitimate. It looks good. He wants the people to think of him as anointed, the legitimate successor to David, as the anointed over God's people. To deceivers, it isn't a matter of calling, but of appearing to be called. They need to have the right credentials to gain a following. They need to have the right credentials to gain a following. This is why evaluating a call is so important. Does the sense of call focus on God's glory or the one claiming to be called? Is the external call bolstered by godly character and fruitful gifts? Let me tell you, when I studied for ordination, it took forever. It is a massive pain. There's a reason they call it the trials. It is a trial. First, you have to be approved by your own local session to be a candidate. They have to recommend you to presbytery. You cannot go to presbytery and say, I feel called to be a minister. Well, what do your local elders think? Because if they don't think you're called, we don't think you're called. Then you become a candidate. At some point, very often at the same time, you become an intern and you have to actually start doing pastoral work. And if you stink, you don't get called. If you're selfish, you don't get called. If you're trying to make yourself look big, you don't get called. But let's say you make it through that. Your internship is approved. So now you get to study for ordination and take your tests, right? Wrong. Now you have to find a church that's actually willing to have you as its pastor. Because if no particular church wants you, then God has not called you. Because if God has called you to be a pastor, then you're going to be a pastor. And if you find a church that says, yes, we will have this man to be our pastor, now, you poor sucker, now you get to take the written exams. Look, some of those written exams, I was like, okay, I know this stuff, I'm good. But one of them is on the English Bible. Do you know what they can test you on in your English Bible exam? Anything in the English translation of the Bible. Who was King Hezekiah's son? Do you know the answer? Thankfully, they didn't ask me. What is the outline of the book of Job? The whole outline. Which speaker went when? Really? Yes. Tell me, in what passage would I find this Bible story that no one ever talks about? I'm not kidding. And then if you pass those, if you have your oral exams. And by the way, those don't just cover character, don't just cover your knowledge, neither does the written. The first and arguably one of the two most important, other than your knowledge of the Bible, your character. What is your practice of personal devotion? What is your practice of tithing? What sins do you struggle with? Confess. And you confess. You don't hide anything from presbytery. They'll find out. What are your friends? Who are they? God asked that question because they want to make sure you're a personable person. All this thoroughness. And then if you pass that, you get examined by presbytery. And then, only then, will they ordain you. Why? Because heaven above, how dangerous it is when a man fakes a calling and takes leadership among God's people. It is destructive. That's why churches often have rules like you have to be a member so long before you can teach Sunday school. We need to get to know you. We need to see your character. It's not that we don't trust you, it's that in God we trust. All others must pay cash. You know? That's just how it is. I know how sinful I am. I assume you're at least that sinful. I got to know you so I can trust you as well as I trust myself, which is not all the way, but enough. We also are warned deceivers won't openly rebel against Christ and the gospel at first. It appears that Absalom eased into rebellion. It looks like he was trying to make it appear that he was succeeding David legitimately. You have to remember, back then, it wasn't like today. Kings didn't die and then their oldest son took power. The king chose which of his children was going to be his heir, and then he would raise him up to power, declaring him king while he was still alive. And then the old king would mentor him, tutor him, and slowly go into semi-retirement. Basically saying, I still outrank you, I can veto whatever you do, but you know what? I'm old, I'm tired. By the end of David's life, he was bedridden. He actually did raise Solomon to power and let him sit on the throne and reign. Because, David's stuck in his bed. He can no longer effectively rule the country. Time to transition. This is how it was done. And it looks like the people thought this is what was happening. That when he declared, I am king in Hebron, they just thought David was cool with this. That this was the natural transition of power. Deceivers are often most effective when they start out working in the church and then lead people out. We see this pattern quite a lot today. I'm not going to name names. I don't have to. We have seen a slew of professing Christians walk out of the church and publish blog posts and articles to drag as many people out with them as they possibly can. They'll say, I've left my faith behind and I want you to come with me. And out they walk. And all these people who got wowed by them walk out the door. Pretending to serve Christ gives deceivers the chance to build a power base without their followers even catching on, and before you know it, you're part of the rebellion. These 200 men went with Absalom, and they were innocent. They had no clue what was going on till it was too late. And they're already in the conspiracy. They're of the Absalom party, and they didn't even know there was a party. Always ask yourself who you're being asked to follow. A godly leader points you to Christ, adding you to Jesus' kingdom. A deceiver points to himself, adding you to his own kingdom. Deceivers will also seek to turn other leaders to their cause. Absalom reached out to Ahithophel, a counselor whose wisdom was famous and who was a trusted member of David's court. And he calls him and says, join me, Ahithophel. Be my counselor now. Leaders going from Christ to the deceiver accomplishes two things. First, it increases the resources of the deceiver. He now has helpers who can use their talents to strengthen his cause. Absalom can now look to Ahithophel and go, what do I do now? And get a good answer. This is a man who is shrewd. He knows his stuff. It also gives him an air of legitimacy. If these respected people are with him, surely this is God's will, right? I mean, Ahithophel is with Absalom. David's got to be for this, right? And even if David kicks a bit, Ahithophel's with him. This has got to be the smart decision, right? The smart money's on this guy. Let's go with this guy. It's important to remember that professing Christian leaders can be hypocrites too. Even faithful leaders can and do get caught up in fads. I remember recently reading an article where a member of the Gospel Coalition apologized for statements he had made in the past. There was a moment, it was very politically heated, very culturally heated. He got caught up in it. He made declarations. He made statements. And now he had to say, guys, I really should have just kept my mouth shut. I misunderstood the situation. I did not have enough information. I said things that were very hurtful and very divisive. And it was not good. This is a faithful man, and even he got caught up in the moment. How much worse when a hypocrite sees a leader who's leading in the way he really wants to go. He's like, I can get behind this guy. Never follow a leader blindly, and never adopt a view or cause merely because a particular leader or group of leaders have done so. Always commit yourself to follow God speaking in Scripture, not the wisdom of men. Now, looking over this matter, we may be led to wonder how it is that so many deceivers could arise in our midst in the first place. And that answer is here too in the background. Deceivers thrive when diligence is lacking. Some of the commentators I was reading pointed out Absalom wasn't acting in private. You don't have a chariot and 50 men running in front of you without people knowing. You don't pull people aside in the city gate without people noticing what's happening. And if people are noticing this, who are they telling about it? David. And what does David do? He does the same thing he's done for the past little while in these stories. He does absolutely nothing. This is a time when discipline is needed. The Board of Education needs to be applied to the seat of learning, but it is not happening. In fact, in this case, it's worse than that because David is king and his son is a prince. It is time for the king to call his subject, lest he forget, into his courtroom and stand in front of him and ask him, who am I? You're my father. No, who am I? I am your king. And don't you get thinking that you're the king. The king is who I say is king next. And in David's case, the king is who God says is king next, and he says it's Solomon. You get rid of that chariot. You get rid of those runners. You stop pulling people away from my judges. You bow before me, boy. You don't set yourself up as the man. You are not the man. Time for the king to be the king. But he doesn't do it. Either David somehow didn't know what was going on, or he just failed to deal with his son's sins. We cannot turn a blind eye to those who would use the church and things of God as a jumping off point for their own advancement. It has to be dealt with. We need to correct those who don't understand Christ's call to humble service of God and others. Look, just about everybody who goes into ministry has too prideful a view of themselves. It's a high and exalted call. You start learning deep and wondrous things, and you get to go to seminary, and you're around these wonderful, godly men who've done wondrous things in the church. I had a professor, this man, every time he spoke in presbytery, what he said had to be done. Not because he was high and mighty, but because he rarely spoke, and when he did, he was so wise you couldn't argue with him. Someone even joked after he spoke. He quoted that old movie, The Ten Commandments, so let it be written, so let it be done. In a whisper, of course, because he was both of our professors, and he'd have gotten on us if he'd heard that. But anyhow, he had that authority. And the both of us had to learn by going into ministry, you're nothing. You're expendable. You pour yourself out for the people. They don't pour themselves out for you. You're there to be walked over. You're not there to be glorified. You have to correct those who are young in service and remind them, look, God will give you what you need. God will reward you in time. But these people are sheep, and you're here to feed them. They are not there to feed you. That takes maturity. And we need to put out those whose service is only offered for self-interest. Sadly, for all we do, people will sneak in. Deceivers will come into the church and try to build up their own following. And when you've tried to correct them and they ain't learning, you've got to put them aside. You've got to put them aside. Hopefully, they'll learn once they come under discipline and realize, I can't do that. That was sinful. But if they don't learn, we cannot reinstate them. They are dangerous. I heard just recently of a man, his church did cast him out. His presbytery put him under discipline, stripped him of his ordination. Do you know what he's doing now? He's planted his own church. He can't get authority the right way, he'll get it the wrong way. It is dangerous. We need to guard our own hearts to ensure our loyalty belongs to Jesus and to Him alone. I can warn you about deceivers and falsehoods all day long, and I have to because, let's face it, in this day and age, they don't even have to come into the church to get hold of you. They're on the TV screens. They're on YouTube. They're on the internet. They're on the radio. They're in your podcasts. They're everywhere. I have to warn you about this because they have unprecedented access. But I've also got to warn you because you don't have to be a pastor to get led astray. Anybody can try to be a big fish in a little pond. And we have to guard our own hearts, whatever our calling, and make sure that we are true and faithful. And what's the best way to do that? Do you know what the best way to spot a counterfeit is? Know the real thing. I believe they asked an art expert once, how is it you can spot a forged painting so quickly? Have you studied all these forgeries? No, I don't study forgeries. I study the works of the actual artist. I know his work well enough that I can tell if a brushstroke is off. I can tell if the style is wrong. I can tell because I know the real thing. Do you want to know the best way to not get led astray by a deceiver? Fix your eyes on Jesus. Know Jesus. Study Jesus. Walk with Jesus. Know His Word. Hide it in your heart. The more you look to Christ, the more impervious to deception you will be. Fix your eyes firmly on Christ. You can't be fooled by a deceiver when your mind and heart are fixed on the genuine article. Let's go to the Lord our God in prayer.